Here we go, and we are
live. We are live. Hello. Hello, Facebook.
We're back with another episode of True North News Live. I'm joined again by my wonderful co-host, Andrew.
This is Daniel Tyree right here, the brains behind the operation, really.
You're too kind.
Hey, Daniel, what are we drinking here?
So, Lost Chapter Revive Ale.
Your Revive Ale.
A nice
from Toronto, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, Toronto Brewery.
I'm going to be drinking it in a signature True North News mug because you got to stay on brand. I think.
I think so.
Oh.
Okay. So let's get into it. Actually, before we get into it, let's not get into it. Some of the important things that are happening today in politics that we won't be touching too much on today. Today, Stephen Harper, ex-Prime Minister of Canada, has his new book released.
Right here, right now.
Politics in the Age of Disruption. So he's back in the media, a couple of op-eds in some mainstream media websites and some big American news network interviews. Stephen Harper's back in the news, and that should play pretty well for the CPC, as he's been a fervent advocate of a United Conservative Party. On that note, CPC leader Andrew Scheer is off in India, proving that if you don't fill your trip with ridiculous antics, you can actually have relative diplomatic success.
Yeah, you don't need to dance or dress up in costumes in foreign countries.
Or, invite known terrorists on your diplomatic team.
You don't even need to bring your family. Who knew? Of course, if you brought the Scheer family, all those kids, you'd need like a separate plane, right? So,
Scheer doing a great job.
He only has 5 kids.
He got to meet with Prime Minister Modi within 2 days, as opposed to within a week. So, big wins over Justin Trudeau there. And the final big conservative character in Canadian politics, Maxime Bernier, officially registers the People's Party of Canada with Elections Canada today. Big for the party, as they will now be able to have tax deductions on on any sort of donation to their party. We were talking about that earlier in the week with Caleb. We suggested that that wouldn't be available until they were able to run a candidate. That's not the case. Now that their party is official, they can start to really raise money. They went with a list of almost 500 members that had already signed up with the party. A minimum of 250 is necessary in Canada, but according to Bernier, they've already raised up to $340,000, and they have over 22,000 members registered online. So big growth for the PPC in only a month since the announcement. But with that stuff out of the way, let's start covering the stuff that we are going to talk about.
Yeah, a couple big developments, really.
Yeah. So we are going to be covering the Liberals' new Election Modernization Act, or Bill C-76. This was a bill put forward by the Liberals in mid-May, and it forms to make some more soft electoral changes, even though they kind of threw away larger electoral reform earlier in the year. Our second topic will be talking about the carbon tax, the kind of implications, what the carbon tax is, as well as the new kind of Alberta-Ontario alliance that has been forming as a result. And then we'll be closing off our show with the recent pro-choice and pro-life violence that we've been seeing kind of break out across Canadian major universities mostly, but in civil society as well, which has been a bit of a disturbing trend, if you ask me. But let's start at the beginning. So, Bill C-76. Have you been following this?
Election Modernization Act. Well, I'll confess I'm not an expert on it, but I mean, this is kind of an example of, I think, the Liberals trying to recoup a little bit of credibility on the elections file. Obviously, they had made the big promise that 2015 would be the last election under first past the post, that they were going to do a sweeping reform. They ended up abandoning that for a number of reasons. partly because the Prime Minister's preferred system wasn't going to go through. Partly because, as he stated, there wasn't a consensus on the issue. And I think that they were loath to do a referendum on the issue. Mm-hmm. But now they're tackling some of the smaller things around foreign election meddling and election finance.
Yeah, so those are the two main, at least that's what they say the kind of target of the Bill C-76 is. So Bill C-76 has come towards a fair amount of scrutiny since it was announced. As I said, the Liberals announced it in around mid-May, and a lot of critics said that was kind of too short a time span before of an election to be tampering with how the system works. But regardless, the Liberals have obviously a majority government, so they're able to push these things through regardless of what opposition thinks. So we went through, and as well as many other journalists, and kind of parsed through some of the amendments that are included in Bill C-76, and there is some insidious kind of policies there. And what has been really catching the news lately was a Sun News report this week that an asylum seeker had received a voter registration card.
Mm-hmm.
So voter registration cards, and this has become increasingly controversial because one of the main critiques of Bill C-76 is the Liberals have been trying to kind of streamline election registration process and stuff like this and simplify it. So I don't know if you've noticed over the last few elections, but it seems to get easier and easier to vote. You can use more and more things as a relevant credential to prove that you're a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
And now the Liberals have opened it up so that you'll only need a voter registration card. And this is obviously a problem considering, apparently, whether in error or by some more insidious tactic, asylum seekers are receiving voter registration cards. So in this story, we had a Mexican, a family of Mexican refugees who were political refugees fleeing a state that was oppressing them. There was problems with the drug cartel, and even the kind of corrupt police were involved with the situation. So they fled and left for Canada. These people were disappointed when they received a voter registration card because they know they're not citizens. It takes some time to become a citizen in Canada, about 3 to 5 years, depending on the process, to tick off all the boxes. And these people thought it was unfair to real official Canadians, that they would be allowed to vote. So they reported it to Sun News. But according to them, their family, they have friends and colleagues that are in similar situations as them, not legal citizens quite yet, and they similarly apparently received voter registration cards. So there seems to be, a bit of a mistake or some.
Well, I wonder. I just that's the question, right? Is whether it's a mistake or not. I think that what is probably worrisome for the government is that suddenly a story about electoral reform has come back to immigration and asylum seeking, right? And so the messaging for them has been thrown off a little bit. And look, you have on immigration file, you have a few stories now piling up that don't add a whole lot of credibility for this government, right? So you have illegal or irregular border crossers, you have ISIS fighters, the former ISIS fighters in the country that the government doesn't seem to have much of a plan to deal with, and now you have asylum seekers who shouldn't be eligible to vote getting voter cards. So when you take these smaller stories and add them all up, the government starts to look like they're fumbling on some of these issues, and it distracts from what they want to be talking about in C-76. Right?
Yeah, and then we have some more conspiracy-oriented critics that are saying, like, Justin Trudeau's trying to increase his voter base by generously accepting people and offering them social programs. How would you not want to vote for the politician
Yeah.
that gave you
Yeah.
a new life, and thousands of dollars a month in social programs and economic support. So I don't know how valid that is, but it's definitely a curious error, and we'll see where this kind of trail goes. I'm sure there'll be much more reporting in the conservative media around this issue, but it is certainly curious. But larger than that, there are some other kind of innocuous clauses within Bill C-76. I've just kind of gone through the summary and highlighted some key points here. So one of the other controversial things is more around finance. So a big criticism that the Conservatives were quick to jump on was this act kind of restricts campaigning to the RIP period and the pre-RIP period, which limits the amount of funding or
amount of spending
that they can do on advertisement, which in this kind of media age, advertising has become more and more kind of essential to the political process. But the real concern there is that there's a bit of an inequity, because the Liberals could still put money towards government advertising as opposed to
or any party
to campaign
for that matter.
advertising.
Any party that's in government could continue to spend as long as it's government advertising, government programs or what have you.
But once you get that close to an election, the borders between
that's right,
promoting your government and promoting your party, or
a minister or the prime minister out in a paid ad saying, "Isn't it great that we've done this? Isn't it great that we're making lives better for people in Ontario?" And it looks like an election ad when it's in fact a government ad.
So this has drawn the air from most third parties. A more positive change that was kind of included in here that hasn't been talked about as much was there's some more strict rules around third parties. So that would be outside organizations that aren't political parties but that provide for them. So, these maybe we have anti-abortion kind of lobbyists and third-party groups that, or gun advocacy, or whatever kind of small special interest groups. In American politics, often these smaller voices that share some values corroborate and become larger political action committees or PACs or super PACs even, depending on their size. So the new limitations within Bill C-76 will kind of prevent collusion between these interest groups, which should kind of keep them in a more stable lobbyist position rather than kind of major influential economic actors. But at the same time, the bill also increases the amount individual third-party groups can spend. So whereas they can't organize and team up to have more influence, they do have more potential economic support. Some other interesting things I saw in here were things about childcare and stuff. They want to increase the amount that would be reimbursed, even up to 90% for things like childcare costs and costs that would prevent, lower income workers from participating in the political game, which is essential for a democratic system. But it just concerns me when you get to the higher end of things and you get, maybe candidates that do not need as much support, because you see the likes of Justin Trudeau with a millionaire but needs support from the government to take care of his children is a bit kind of ridiculous. And of course that's a fringe case, but I would like to see stuff like this, strictly limited to those who need it.
Yeah, of course. Are there any other major points? Because I think financing it's an interesting thing to focus on for this government, particularly because the Conservatives, we know, out-fundraise the Liberals in some quarters 2-1. Yeah. So I think this is seen by Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives as an attempt to kind of cut out the war chest from the equation coming up in this election. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it would. Well, it definitely plays a big game, but the Liberals definitely have. They still have gigantic funding, and they'll be able to be competitive. But these kind of restrictions on how much the Conservatives can wield that funding advantage will definitely play well for the Liberals. But at the same time, it does play favorably for any of the small parties as well, kind of limiting the difference between the big and the large.
Do you think the bill will substantially change the 2019 election?
I mean,
like, to me, it does. In as much as it's focusing on financing, it's trying to get third parties, especially foreign actors, out of the game. I mean, I think they're playing on some of the Russian meddling in the U.S. kind of thing. But to me, it all seems sort of small potatoes.
I mean,
in the long run, what do you think?
Political advertisements are influential, but I don't like to see them that much.
Yeah.
So I don't mind the kind of restriction. I do think the kind of opening things up to be so that you can vote with only a driver's license or only a voter registration card is ridiculous. Only citizens should be voting. And considering this would be effectively, we have 50,000 Syrian refugees since he came into power in 2015. We have an additional almost 50,000 illegal border crossers. It's not hard to get a driver's license. Like, you don't need to be a citizen by any stretch of the imagination. You can have a passport, even if it's a foreign passport. You can get a driver's license. Like, as long as you're above 16, you can get a driver's license. So if you can vote with only those things without real proof of citizenship, and 100,000 roughly voters.
So you're saying, depending on where these where newcomers to Canada are located, like if they are concentrated in certain ridings, that could shift how those ridings go in 2019.
Yeah. That could be a huge influence. And I'm not even saying that necessarily plays out well for the Liberals, because while they are backers of these refugees and illegal border crossers, Andrew Scheer hasn't taken a particularly hard-line stance against these migrants.
Nope.
And on top of that, a lot of migrants from a lot of areas around the world that these migrants do tend to come from have just innately more conservative values.
Well, but I think also, like, that's a really great point. I think that because immigration largely has been a consensus issue for all parties, I think that most new immigrant groups in Canada are open to voting for multiple parties. And so you find NDP, Liberal, Conservative and Green Party candidates that can appeal quite honestly and quite convincingly to immigrants, especially new immigrant groups.
Yeah. So I, generally speaking, kind of have an issue with changing electoral law this close to an election. I thoroughly disagree with that, and I don't think this is an effective way at making our elections freer or fairer.
Well, the way they were talking about the law, you'd think this was the greatest thing for elections,
Yeah.
That this was, bringing our elections into the 21st century, everything, like...
it's called the Elections
Modernization Act. I don't know. I think it's overblown.
And something we didn't talk about is central to the kind of selling of this bill has been the curbing of international interference. And what did they remove? There was a $500 limit on international actors getting involved with our election, and they removed that. So Russia's $500 worth of Facebook ads won't get to influence Canadians.
So it's kind of a non-issue, is what you're saying.
I'm just, like, it seems to me very Trojan horse-esque.
Yeah. Because
they're really selling that kind of fear-mongery aspect of it. That's like, ooh, the Russian boogeyman's gonna
come in and,
that got Doug Ford and Donald Trump elected is gonna get, I don't know, Andrew Scheer, who's the boogeyman? But there is a bunch of kind of questionable things that has been kind of shoved into this omnibus Trojan horse that makes me skeptical. So overall, I'd say no, but I don't think it's the most influential thing on the whole. With that, why don't we move on to our next topic? Carbon pricing, carbon tax, whatever you want to call it. Depends on, as usual, jargon depends on which side of the bench you sit on. But
well, in particular, like what we're seeing with recent elections, Quebec, Ontario, of course, upcoming election in Alberta is the provincial governments that we're going to have to carry out the dirty work, so to speak, for Prime Minister Trudeau on his carbon tax plan. They're now electing new governments, and there's a growing opposition at the provincial level to this carbon tax plan. Not so much a growing opposition to climate change action per se, but I think what has happened is that because the Liberal government has so closely tied the idea of a carbon tax to their plan for fighting climate change, and as we've talked about before, their plan for getting pipelines built, it's kind of become this all or nothing zero-sum game. But you're seeing more provincial actors kind of pushing back against this, and most notably, of course, the rally that was hosted by Doug Ford, Premier in Ontario, and Jason Kenney, who is going to be running to be Premier in Alberta, and if the polls are to be believed, his United Conservative Party will replace Rachel Notley's NDP government in Alberta. Mm-hmm. So a fair bit of opposition to the carbon tax. I don't know. The Prime Minister seems a little bit defiant. He seems to want to go ahead, and I think like journalists like Andrew Coyne have said that they're pretty positive Justin Trudeau and the Liberals will campaign on a carbon tax in 2019, but will that work for them given the fact that so many provinces are now against it?
And they've also set a date for, I believe it's January, that they'll start imposing that provinces have to put something in place. But to just give some background on what a carbon tax is and why it's become such a central kind of topic, it is a pretty simple concept. So the problem with a lot of a greenhouse gas emitting industry is that they can literally save money by what we call a concept called externalities. So these are costs that are non-economic costs. So a company can save money by not investing in carbon scrubbers in their smokestacks, let's say. But the cost is more carbon in the atmosphere that will need to be cleaned up by a government or anything like this. So the intention behind a carbon price is to put a price on carbon that to bring those kind of externalities back into the market model so that the market can optimize and reduce the costs, both the economic costs and the environmental costs. So in the Paris Accord, which is the kind of international agreement supposed to govern environmental action in the modern world, there is a supposition of a global carbon tax. Now, this has been hugely controversial all over the world, of course, as taxes generally are. But so the Liberal government wants to impose a $50 per ton carbon tax, and there has been some studies to look into how much that will actually cost the average Canadian citizen, and it's becoming growingly unpopular across the country because it's looking like roughly $800 to $1,000 per person per year. Although it depends on the province on how much your carbon price would be, because it's difficult to calculate because pretty much all industry at every step has some sort of carbon emission associated with it, whether it's transporting the apples to the grocery store from the farm. Like, there's a carbon price associated with that because a car moved it, and the car has gas, and the gas is going to have a carbon tax on it, and stuff like this. So, carbon tax, the tax would be implicit in kind of all goods and all kind of...
Well, and this is why you see more conservative politicians labeling it as a tax on everything, right? So that's sort of been the rhetorical flourish they've used to kind of push back against carbon pricing. But look, even conservative leader Andrew Scheer claims, although he has no details out for a climate plan, claims to want to meet the Paris
the CPC
Accord,
voted in favor of the
targets without imposing a carbon tax. And in fact, the targets that were agreed upon in Paris were the emissions reduction targets of the previous Conservative government under Stephen Harper. So I think what's happened and what's entered into some people's mindset, partly because the government has been saying it a lot, the federal government, is that a carbon tax is necessary. And what these provincial governments are saying is, whoa, wait a minute. Do we necessarily need a carbon tax?
Is this the best way of tackling it?
Is this the best way of doing it? And something that Jason Kenney has pointed out, which I think has some merit, is that polluters could simply move their operations to a different jurisdiction where there is no carbon tax. They'll move it out of Canada. We'll still have the same amount of pollution worldwide. And of course, we'll lose economic activity because we won't be as competitive.
So that's one of the key kind of criticisms of a carbon tax, and that's why the Paris Accord strives to put a global carbon tax. It needs all these world players to agree.
It needs the buy-in of almost every major economy. Yep.
Almost impossible.
Yep.
But the carbon price really doesn't work without it, because even in that case, it could be even worse. You said we'll have the same amount of carbon emissions at the end of the day because it'll just get outsourced to someone. But that's not even necessarily true. What if it gets outsourced to a country with even lower environmental standards than Canada, right? We might actually make the problem worse by pushing investment towards lower tax jurisdictions, and that's a serious problem. We can think of solutions that will keep these companies here and will keep them accountable, but instead the carbon tax will likely chase away investment, which we've already had trouble with changes in the United States around corporate tax rates and the slashing of regulations across the board. We want to add another regulation on top of this, which is just going to discourage more and more investment from coming into Canada. What else did I want to say on that topic? Well, and then we even saw this come up on Twitter the other day with everyone's favorite Prime Minister's advisor, Jerry Butts. He shares a tweet from the Nobel Prize Facebook page, and it was a Nobel laureate who had suggested that a global carbon price is the best way of combating climate change. And it's funny because Jerry Butts puts this out and basically calls conservatives stupid climate deniers, because if you disagree, not with climate science, not with if you disagree with the carbon tax, now you're a climate denier, you're anti-science, anti-economics. Even though this one guy, he's a Nobel laureate, I respect that, but economists, it's a pseudoscience. It's not a perfect science. And even though this guy says one thing, I'm sure you can find many economists that say another. And he did say a global price. So I just found it so funny that the media and Jerry Butts and a bunch of people start pushing this article about this Nobel laureate when he's not even saying the Canadian plan is good. In fact, he would probably disagree, given that he says a global tax is the way to properly address it. So just the political class hijacking academia for its own ends is something that generally
I think really what I'm more interested in, though, is what this means politically for the federal government, in particular in its federal-provincial relations, right?
Let's go across the country.
I think
we have problems, right? The NDP government, in British Columbia, maybe not outwardly against the carbon tax. They've had problems with the pipeline. It's not hard to imagine that they would drum up problems.
But they have a tax already in place in British Columbia. I can't remember what level it's at right now, but similarly in Alberta, that's where Jason Kenney, where we get this opposition that's a little bit more forceful from Jason Kenney, because he's going to have to campaign, and he's campaigning specifically to repeal. I think he says his first piece of legislation would be to repeal the carbon tax. Manitoba, you have opposition from Brian Pallister. Saskatchewan, skipped over Saskatchewan. You have opposition from the Saskatchewan Party and Scott Moe. Alberta, opposition from Doug Ford. Quebec, now François Legault, not in support, although Quebec does have their own strategy already in place, their own system.
He doesn't have an obvious stance on it. He hasn't really... It wasn't a central part around there in the Quebec election like it has been in a lot of recent ones. But I would not be surprised to see him fall into the kind of Ford-Kenney coalition. And then Brian Pallister from Manitoba, as you mentioned, he's just jumping on this kind of...
That's right.
On this
I think
train
that's because they're seeing the dominoes start to fall. Some of the Atlantic provinces, I mean, the dust hasn't really settled in New Brunswick, as we've said.
I wouldn't be surprised, though, if the PC government came out ahead, that they jump on this train as well.
I believe Prince Edward Island is neck and neck between Liberals and Green Party in the polling, so likely they'll be supportive of it, but I mean, they're not a major player. So I'm not too sure about some of the other maritime provinces, but I think that as this coalition of anti-carbon tax politicians grows and Canadians maybe start to think about different strategies for tackling climate change, it's going to make the 2019 election, it's going to make carbon taxing a major piece of the 2019 federal election, I think.
I'm curious about that just because of the deadline imposed in January by the government that these provinces have to have something in place. It seems like that'll be really when the sparks start to fly, and if that'll carry over until the fall, I don't know if that's clear. I don't know what'll happen.
The thing is,
it's hard to predict.
So the plan was actually quite ingenious, I think, from a political perspective, because again, the federal government, or the Trudeau Liberals, was getting to claim that they were doing everything possible to meet the Paris climate deal targets, while having the provinces carry out the actual legwork of the policy of imposing this tax. So any fallout from there being new taxation on people would come back to the provincial governments, while the federal government could take credit for leading the charge as a nation tackling climate change. Now that it's going to have to be the federal government as the big bad wolf imposing a carbon tax, I think if it becomes very unpopular, which it already will be in some of these provinces that are opposed to it, Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives especially are going to pick up on that, and they're going to be campaigning in 2019 to repeal that federally imposed carbon tax. And I think that if the Prime Minister can't make a good claim as to why it's absolutely necessary for people to pay more, I think that he may have a losing issue in 2019.
Again, I don't know if it'll carry all the way through to there. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out. But I think it's important to consider, just how ineffective the carbon tax is, and then is it? It remains
to be seen.
Just looking at Ontario,
I'm not entirely skeptical of I've heard arguments for why a carbon tax would be ineffective. I'm not entirely skeptical of it, partly because it hasn't been tried in our jurisdictions in Canada, and I think that its effect on the economy in British Columbia could be vastly different from Montreal, from Toronto,
and that's
and I think that's partly why the government wanted to make these provincial plans that would be tailored to the specific needs of the province. Yeah. Now that it's going to be something more imposed from Ottawa, I think that it may backfire on them, at least from the point of perception. Yeah. What are people thinking when they see this policy coming from Ottawa that they oppose, that their provincial government opposes, and that maybe Justin Trudeau and the Liberals aren't listening to them?
But the thing is, I don't know if while it's easy to assume people oppose a tax, I don't know if that's clear, because I think the majority of Canadians do, if you look at recent elections, it does seem like the Canadians do want some sort of positive vision for climate change in Canada.
Sure.
I do think that's a major, probably one of the top 3 or 4 major issues with the average Joe. Even if they're
not politically engaged.
Mm-hmm.
If you were, especially if they're not politically engaged, if you were to ask them important issues, I really doubt they would say immigration or the economy. They'd probably say climate change or inequality. I think these are more like just generally popular issues in Canada. And then to look at, like, especially Ontario as a test case, yes, he won a supermajority, which makes it seem like there's huge opposition, but he did only get 39% of the vote. So, like, there still is 60% of voters in Ontario that may have not agreed with the slash the tax kind of position. So I don't, even though you see the government's coming to power, like, this is the first past the post system. It doesn't tell the whole story. So it is kind of...
True, but I mean...
Especially because the Conservatives, as you mentioned, like Andrew Scheer says he's going to get rid of the carbon tax, but he doesn't offer anything clear for the future. Maxime Bernier is the same thing. Get rid of the carbon tax. The private sector will do it. And that's an interesting kind of suggestion. And the private sector has been adjusting. But
you have
people want something real from the government, I think.
Like, even if... people generally, if you ask them their opinion on climate change, would say, oh yes, definitely we need to do something. Yeah. I think time and time again it's been shown that in elections people vote on the economy. People vote on pocketbook issues. If it doesn't matter, especially for
young people,
lower class, middle class, it matters how much you're having to pay for cost of living, what job prospects are out there, how reasonable the government is being with public funds. I think those always come down to be the main issues. Even if different voter segments profess to have strong feelings on some of these issues, at the end of the day, they're probably going to vote on economic issues.
Or at least economic issues encourage people to go vote more than these kind of
That's a good point as well. Sometimes people just stay at home and don't vote, even if they feel strongly, or if their Facebook feed is full of shared articles about a particular issue. Exactly, right.
So even if the environmentalist might be very passionate about climate policy, they might not necessarily be more likely to vote than someone saving $1,000 on their yearly bill. The whole idea of a carbon tax in Canada kind of frustrates me. Not only the sort of outsourcing problem that we talked about earlier, but just generally speaking, Canada's some of the major emitting industries are generally transportation and just general power generation. And Canada's electrical grid is incredibly sustainable. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think a lot of people realize this, but you can Google. It's very simple. Just a province in their energy mix: Ontario energy mix, Alberta energy mix, and it'll show you a pie chart breaking down the most common energy sources. And across the country, oil and coal and natural gas even come up as minorities, except in pretty much every province except for Alberta, unsurprisingly. But provinces like Quebec and Manitoba have like over 95% hydroelectric power grids. In Ontario, we have a lot more nuclear, but we also have huge hydropower and stuff like this. Wind and solar making up smaller percentages. But the kind of looking at Canada as some sort of major contributor to climate change is a bit ridiculous. Even though we do rate highly when it comes to like per capita emissions, it usually just comes from the kind Alberta in the incredibly carbon intensive process it takes to extract and transport bitumen.
But it's true, of
it's
course.
Really an imperfect way of trying to hit the problems that we experience in Canada necessarily. Like there are more important ways to achieve climate goals in Canada, and then if you're going to look at a international kind of agreement like the Paris Accord, maybe it should be taking into account international activity a little bit more than it should be intervening in domestic policies, because there are problems like international transportation of goods, which is generally done mostly on ships, ships that use some of the most dirty fuel imaginable. This is the dregs at the bottom of the barrel. It's this black sludge, and not only is that awful for the environment, but none of any international operations done in international waters is not attributed to any one country. So Canada's carbon emissions don't take into account a massive part of it, which is getting goods from the international marketplace to the Canadian marketplace, and that goes for any major importer or
let's link that. One of our newest followers, Martin Lees, I think his last name here, is asking us here, following live. Thank you for watching us live, Martin. Can you address immigration and its impact on Canada's carbon footprint? In other words, people immigrate here from predominantly low carbon economies. My opinion is that the whole carbon dioxide as a pollutant narrative is in conflict with Canada's immigration policy. That kind of connects a little bit to what we were talking about immigration before. I think if I understand it correctly, it's the idea that that we have from low carbon economies.
Yeah, so they're coming from developing countries that are less carbon intensive or have less carbon emissions, and coming to Canada and participating in a system where it is easier to emit carbon dioxide.
Do you think that's a major factor in the environmental policy? Or do you think that's that kind of shifting our, or even in our economic activity?
I definitely don't think it's a part of our environmental policy. It's definitely a step detached from it that a lot of people would not consider to be a major thing. I mean, you could say the same thing about population growth in general, right? It's kind of difficult.
We'd also have to have the breakdown year over year, which it does change as we respond, as we use immigration as a response to labor shortages to see which countries people are coming from, because oftentimes we're taking higher skilled workers, right? And
a lot of developing countries are actually have dirtier energy production processes, right? We have more advanced,
lower environmental standards,
and less advanced technology. Exactly. They literally have like old, already used technologies from other countries and stuff like this. So I'm not sure of the validity of the claim itself. Just to assume that they don't have, or they have less cars and stuff like this isn't necessarily, like they probably just have, they have a lot of older cars which have really poor gas mileage and stuff like this. So I guess it really depends on the country. Maybe it should be taken into account into our immigration system, like how it does affect. But even like where immigrants settle, like your carbon footprint's going to be different if you live in the country versus if you live in a municipality. Like it's incredibly difficult to see that impact on the environment directly. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
Not too many, no. But I think that definitely, we're talking about a global Paris Accord. We're talking about countries needing to work together on this, and a lot of politicians have pointed to countries like China and said, "Hey, we're a relatively small player as Canadians. Doesn't mean we can't show leadership on these issues, but let's wait until the major polluters like China, India, like the States, till they get on board with major policies."
But the thing is, like, the U.S. are the ones that jumped off of the Paris Accord. This has pushed China, as the most massive economy still bound by it, into a more of a leadership position, and they have done impressive things with their economy. Everyone likes to point to them as the boogeyman, but they have transitioned their energy economy more than any country in the world. They've gone from an incredibly dirty economy to like they put up like a solar panel like every hour. No, like a soccer field worth of solar panels every day for a year in 2017.
But I don't think we can say their environmental record is squeaky clean.
No, of course. There's a bunch of things like plastics put into to oceans and water systems, and
their reliance on coal.
And still they're expanding. So even if their percentages are getting better, they still have an absolute expansion within their coal, even though they're trying to phase out a lot of fossil fuels and stuff. Like, they are doing impressive things, and everyone points to like the negatives. It just frustrates me when everyone points to the negative parts without reasoning the positive.
Because the negative things are important, and I think that's just the point, right? Is that countries like Canada has been a leader on many issues, but shouldn't be expected to solve all of the world's problems. And a lot of people are making the claim, I think rightly so, that if it's going to be a truly international effort, there are some bigger polluters that need to be brought into the conversation. The states is another one. If they're not going to focus in on this particular strategy of carbon taxing, it might not make as much sense for Canada.
Yeah, and then I think, just to go back to his question, I think the important thing when it comes to immigration and climate change is, or at least that a lot of, aggressive climate advocates will point to, is as there are problems that increase due to climate change, like water levels rising and extreme weather events and stuff like this, there'll be more climate refugeeism, and developed countries, developed northern countries that don't have as much of a burden in the impacts of climate change will be forced to accept more and more climate refugees as their countries disappear due to rising water levels and stuff like this, as they become unlivable for various climate related reasons. I think that's the most major issue when it comes to climate change and immigration. But it is the doomsday situation, that has been predicted over and over and over again. Like, the Inconvenient Truth said New York would be underwater by 2010. Again, what's the timelines like, and is it going to be that drastic? It's hard to account for.
Yeah. Well, let's leave that for now, and hopefully we won't be underwater here anytime soon. Although we did have a very warm week here in Waterloo. It was kind of I don't know if you can say this anymore, but it was the Indian summer. I don't know if you're familiar with that expression.
Yes.
When summer comes back, because it got quite cold the last few weeks, and then
I was liking the cool weather.
It has nothing to do with climate change, but I don't know how to segue into this next topic, so let's just get right into it. Politically motivated violence on campuses at peaceful protests. Oh my gosh!
So it's definitely been an important issue for you over the last few months. I think
I've been following this a fair bit. I've always been shocked in this country how the abortion debate has been so. I don't even think it's that polarizing, but we've basically shut out the abortion debate in this country. We've made it something you cannot talk about.
An absolute third rail topic.
Yeah, to even say the word gets everyone kind of tense. And, what's their position going to be? Are they going to support abortion unequivocally? Which I think we saw this week in two major instances that it's gone too far in shutting down that debate. There was a peaceful protest, both in Toronto.
Yeah, we have those clips. We can pick them up right now.
Okay, yeah. Let's see the one of Mary Claire Bissonnette, who is an activist, and she was met by some counter protesters here. And you see this fellow here, who we should say ended up being detained for this, and it's just
fined, not detained.
Horrific. Well, he was arrested briefly.
He wasn't actually, disappointingly. So let's just play this clip.
It's hard to confuse everybody.
But still, it's better to be. You want to kill him with kindness, remember?
That's right. What?
So here he confronts.
They actually have people filming you the whole time.
Confronts her. He provides the.
Guess what? Hey.
Destruction of private property. It's against the law.
Somebody gets raped by somebody, and they're like, I'm a
What if they're raped?
16-year-old
What if
and
they're
I can
16?
have this baby.
Extremist case.
Think you should keep it?
It's a baby.
She
If
says,
someone is
"Hey,
raped and she gave birth
still
and
a
she decided to
child."
kill her 3-year-old child.
And he winds up. Boom!
I meant to get your phone!
Unbelievable.
I love the wind-up and then the immediate apology. I saw this totally live. I saw it kind of the night before it became popular, and I was just sitting right here actually and just couldn't stop giggling, even though it is kind of disturbing. So I think really what was most disappointing was kind of in the lieu of that, the cops were called as people were yelling in the background, but the cops did not do much. They said it wasn't a serious assault, and they didn't follow through with anything at the time. Apparently, they didn't even get out of their cars to deal with the young woman. So that was pretty disappointing. But then in the Lou, once this kind of went viral and blew up and got picked up by kind of American alternative news and all this, he was identified and he was charged with I think it was 9 counts of assault.
He was arrested
and 8 more criminal charges.
His name's Jordan Hunt. He was arrested and charged Saturday night. Look, the main thing about this, again, is that you had a peaceful protest. You had a counter-protest. I've been at these types of events, especially nowadays in Canada. The pro-life protesters are, like, the most peaceful. They basically just stand there holding signs, and sometimes they engage in some conversation with people. But the very boisterous, very loud, in your face is often the counter protesters, which is their right, but not when it crosses the line into this kind of violence. I think what is so upsetting as well is that some of the more pro-life politicians in this country have condemned it outright. Garnet Jennis, a young member of parliament from out west, started a website, Stop Political Violence, has called on the Prime Minister to condemn this. Andrew Scheer has called on the Prime Minister, Jason Kenney, saying, look, Mr. Prime Minister, you've made many statements saying violence against women we should have zero tolerance for violence against women in this country, and yet there's silence on this issue. I don't see how you can have it both ways.
Yeah, there is a bit of hypocrisy there.
And especially when you compare it to like other kind of political, pseudo-political instances, like the whole hijab hoax kind of thing that's been pointed to by a lot of critics, when even though it was turned out to be untrue, when a young Muslim girl was assaulted and had her hijab cut by, supposedly had her hijab cut with scissors or whatever, the Prime Minister was on that within moments, within hours.
Yep.
But he has still to this day said nothing about the woman getting kicked.
But let's just be clear. In this country, if you are pro-life, you cannot run for the Liberal or NDP party. You face the risk of not getting advancement in politics in all major parties. You have to be quiet in even in academia, in politics, and now even private citizens are at risk if they are peacefully protesting this policy or non-policy in Canada, which basically states that we have no federal law against abortion.
We'll get more into
insane.
the abortion law specifically in a little bit. But it is quite disappointing to see violence in response to any topic. Like, we as Canadians, we should be able to freely associate and express our political opinions regardless of topic, and to be met with violence is disappointing and unacceptable. And none of the major parties have any sort of abortion policy. I don't think it's mentioned in any of them, unless it's to say we're not going to touch it.
And that's what I mean.
Even the new People's Party of Canada, which has a bunch of these third-rail topics kind of embedded into their platform, doesn't touch abortion.
Deal with it.
So they're bold enough to touch supply management, but not
in fact, before we go into the second example here, that first clip that we showed got international news. It was seen around the world. People saw this as a violent act against a peaceful protester, a woman protester in Canada, even to the point where Ben Shapiro on his election special show on Fox News, which was the most viewed program of that night, I believe, he showed the clip and did an entire segment on how we should be able to discuss difficult topics in his country, in the United States. I think it applies equally to Canada, including abortion. Even if it's a tough debate, it should be done respectfully, But we shouldn't be silencing people with policies or with violence. But I think you have the second example here.
And I think it really caught fire because of the obvious hypocrisy, right? He's like, I'm protecting women, and then he literally attacks the woman.
Yeah.
But then also, like, did Ben mention that it was in Canada?
No, he sort of referenced it.
Exactly. I saw it
broadly.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
But no one was saying it's in Toronto, Canada.
I think on their article they wrote it, but he did it as a quick montage. But I mean, the point was the same, right? Is that
I just thought it was strange.
This is the kind of ideology that is pervasive in the counter protesters. Let's see. This is at Ryerson, isn't it?
Yeah, it got far less views.
But it's actually, ironically, I think it's more. I mean, the optics of in the first clip of the man straight up kicking her to her face. Were more blatant, but in this clip I think it's actually more violent.
Yeah. So the first one only has around 4.5 million views. Has about 4.5 million views. The second one only has about 30,000.
Yeah.
But this one actually hits really close to home for me because my sister goes to Ryerson, and this happened literally the day after. What's going on here? It went on the day after the Jordan Hunt incident occurred. So I was talking to my sister about True North News.
Here, switch over the screen there.
True North News and about what happened with Jordan Hunt. And she's like, "You'll never believe what I literally just saw." And she was actually a bystander in the background of this video. So
yes, our embryos developing. We understand what they look
and I can hear these people.
So if you take that image or that couple of cells or whatever you want to call it, that organism.
Like, I don't think we should have a right to kill somebody else.
Maybe deal with the shit that's causing the abortions in the first place.
That's if you take it out in one piece, right? But how an abortion, how are they taken out?
What an abortion does is they're not taking it out, they're terminating it, and then the cells are being reabsorbed by the body.
You can see
I would argue that because in abortion, they have to collect.
It's so peaceful, and it turns so hysterical. Like she's throwing... Throwing things around, pushing around, yelling. Again, against the woman.
Relax. Yo, relax. Come on. Let's do it. You filming me? What's up? Let's do it.
Yo, relax. Come on. Let's keep the... Relax, everyone.
Just ridiculous.
Let's be respectful.
And before that, it's simply a discussion. It was, as people
you can hear them talking about
it, and suddenly there's this outburst. It's insane, but I just can't imagine the response for other policy issues. There are very few, if any, policy issues that have this kind of closed off status, like we've just been talking about carbon tax. There are passionate people about that. There's passionate people on gun reform. There's passionate people on other issues. I get that abortion is a serious issue, but if we can't have these kinds of conversations, I think it's problematic for our society.
Yeah, no, it definitely, freedom of speech and freedom to communicate is totally essential to be able to parse through what is true and what is not.
Mm-hmm.
And to see that kind of violence even happening so close to my family member is something I'm deeply uncomfortable with. And I hope the university and the police offer and act appropriately to crack down on this, because people are seeing this, and if people are not properly punished by the law as they should be, because what she did was absolutely assault. She threw that metal dolly at the young man on the ground before assaulting, and I just found the reaction of her friends or her fellow protesters so disappointing. Gabby, stop. Gabby, what the hell?
Yeah.
She's going off on these people. Like,
And we're talking
I wouldn't associate with someone like that, but if I did, I would definitely be, trying to restrain them from attacking innocent bystanders.
Yeah.
Just very disappointing from I'm glad it could have been incited into almost a riot, right? If people
however you want to
fighting,
call it, like on an isolated incident, it is bullying, assault, whatever, all the things like you say that we're taught as kids. Don't be a bystander, don't just look on. And you have all of these people who I think are blinded by their ideology, their opposition to this, that they will not even lift a finger, meaningfully to try to stop this. And, hopefully the backlash against these two instances of violence against pro-life women is going to let people know that this is unacceptable, but I don't think it will meaningfully stop unless the more progressive politicians in this country, including the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, speak out against it definitively.
Yeah.
For my money, unless he does that, he has a very tenuous claim on the male feminist
with the grope
status.
and the...
You can't call yourself a male feminist, Mr. Prime Minister, if you don't condemn two peaceful female protesters being attacked for protesting.
Yeah.
You
standing
can't,
up for what they believe in.
Can't.
These two young women are brilliant feminists, standing up for what they believe in against authority, and they're being punished for it, and someone should step up for them, Mr. President.
Yeah,
Mr. Prime Minister. But I feel like just the whole abortion dialogue has been lost in Canada. It's been like just people, like it became so politicized and so emotional. And it just led to the point where anyone who wants to participate in even having a discussion on what our laws should be is deemed as someone that's pro-life. And if you're pro-life, you fall into this dehumanized kind of cohort of people who don't understand women and don't respect women and want to control women. And this is the kind of narrative that allows these people, and obviously these people have not thought, if you're willing to attack someone that is willing to talk to you reasonably, there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with how you view that person. Because that boy who was the brunt of the initial attack, he was reasonable. He was polite. He was not being rude in any way. He did not deserve to receive that. So for someone, there's something off in that girl's thinking process to think it's acceptable for her to do that, and it really falls into this almost social conditioning, this brainwashing that providing abortions, and especially in Canada, where unlike any developed country in the world, there is no substantive abortion law. So having any abortion law is considered oppression to women is absolutely absurd.
Well, and I think that what's problematic too is that I think most Canadians don't actually identify with the traditional pro-life group or the hardcore pro-choice group. I think, and perhaps people watching us right now might want to chime in on it, I think most people have more of a mixed opinion. And here's the problem. We treat even the word abortion as just one thing. We don't parse out a sex-selective abortion, late-term, third trimester abortions, abortions done in the case where the mother's life is in danger. All of these separate procedures that often differ from one another greatly, we don't talk about those as individual cases that one could be for or against. We just say you're either for abortion or against abortion. We don't talk about parental consent for minors seeking an abortion. We don't talk about whether
Doug tried to talk about that
funded. Well, that's right, because
and then
we
he was
shut it
painted
down.
as like the media immediately. He said he didn't even say it in any sort of policy. He said that was kind of his opinion. Maybe 16-year-olds need consent. And the way the media handled it was And
he wants to open up the debate. He's
exactly,
you know.
and then you go even further, and you get like the kind of more like meme oriented kind of true North 99 kind of pages, and they start sharing things like, Doug Ford wants to steal this all from you. He wants to oppress women. And it's just so far detached from the actual comment that he made. Like, the media is particularly unhinged when it comes to this topic. And I think it just gets so much more ridiculous when you consider, as you kind of touched on, there is no substantive abortion law in Canada. So to suggest any limitations, to say, maybe we shouldn't allow abortions at 8 months.
Yeah,
like that's not. From my experience talking to people, you start bringing up these kind of fringe cases, as you were talking about, this sex-specific abortions that have become popular in more increasingly Asian-dominated communities like Brampton. When you talk about aborting of disabled children with Down syndrome and stuff like this, when you talk about these kind of fringe cases, people, even progressives, even staunch progressives that think abortion is absolutely necessary, which I do think it is a service that should be provided at some level, they're willing to make concessions. And of course the kind of it's not necessarily easy to get an 8-month abortion. Like, it does come down to the ethics of the particular doctor, but that is available. And honestly, from my perspective, that really shouldn't be available unless medically necessary. Of course, if the mother's life is in danger or something of the sort, there should be exceptions made. But other than that, our abortion policy should have some restrictions. There's no developed country in the world. Your progressive bastions like across the Scandinavia, UK, France, Germany, all these countries have some sort of time sensitive limitation on abortion. These limitations to protect the rights of unborn children, as well as keep people honest and using the system properly. Not getting there's no questions asked, have as many abortions as you want. That allows people to almost rely on abortion as a sort of a birth control, which is absolutely unacceptable and not healthy.
Even more fundamentally is just the idea that in our democracy, which prides itself on freedom, on respect for people, and on free speech, we should be able to, young people, older people, men, women, whoever, should be able to have policy discussions on this topic. And my friends over at some of my friends over at the National Campus Life Network have been doing a series. We've shared a couple of their videos on what they're calling the new dictatorship. And I think that's what it boils down to, is if you are being censored from political pressures from mainstream parties, from the Prime Minister, from people who are going to do violence to whether it's your pro-life club on a campus, you feel as if you cannot speak on these issues and you are living in a dictatorship. And some of these stories that we're hearing more and more of are horrific. They're demeaning. They're people calling names, harassing people online, doing violence, as we've seen in the videos, spitting on people.
That was the one that stood out to me. A professor spitting on a student.
This unbelievable. And at some point we just have to stand up and say, okay, no, we can be respectful citizens, we can share this country and be adults, and we can have these types of discussions on difficult issues without getting into violence, without getting into overheated rhetoric. Hopefully, the hope in a democracy is that the solution that the most people can agree with comes out of that process of dialogue, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's where we find the truth.
Yeah.
Through dialogue.
So,
anyways, I think that's a poetic place to end off. Coming around that time, for anyone that's not already, follow this page. Go to our Facebook page. Get a subscription over there.
And we're also on YouTube.
Yeah. What is
So subscribe to our YouTube page as well, and we're happy to see a lot of new subscribers this week, which is awesome.
Follow me and Andrew on Twitter to stay informed with recent Canadian political topics. We should have a video coming out before the end of the week, so...
And if you're interested
Check that out
in
as well.
coming on the show, or if there are topics that you want us to talk about, make videos on, or have a chat about, please get in touch with us. Even comment on some of our videos. We'd love to talk about anything and everything that is Canadian politics.
It's great when you guys get involved. Anyways, have a great Wednesday night, and we'll see you next week on Thursday, hopefully.
Take care and stay informed, friends. We'll see ya. That's a wrap, buddy.
Good stuff.
I think that was pretty good.